Our next presentation takes us from India to the Middle East, and it will be presented by Josh Ellis, an associate with the Metropolitan Planning Council. Josh has been an associate with the MPC since 2006, and his focus is on advancing the Council's environmental and economic goals through policy research, advocacy, and community engagement. He manages the Council's water resources protection initiatives. I lost my place. Co-authored Before the Wells Run Dry, and now works with state, regional, and local leaders on strategies to sustainably manage Illinois' finite water resources. He also manages the Metropolitan Planning Council's internal GIS for geospatial analysis of emerging environmental, economic, and demographic trends. This work includes investigation into the jobs-housing mismatch, opportunities for transit expansion, and federal investment patterns. Josh managed a small school in Japan prior to receiving his master's degree in Middle Eastern Studies and Public Policy from the University of Chicago. His honors thesis, which has been published in Water, Environmental Security, and Sustainable Rural Development, Conflict and Cooperation in Central Eurasia, compared the political discourse of marsh restoration in southeastern Iraq with the environmental history of the region. He spends his evenings teaching English as a second language at Poder Learning Center in Chicago's Pilsen community. Please join me in welcoming Josh Ellis.
So if you're confused at all about all the different things that I do and the totally non-linear track that my life has taken, you and my parents are in the same boat. So I used to manage a school in Japan. I went to college in Virginia for English. I did public policy and Middle Eastern studies here, and now I work on environmental policy in the Chicago region, and I'm actually going to come back tomorrow and talk about water issues here in the Chicago region. And so with that in mind, and then I teach in the evenings. And so when Jamie and Alex were talking to me about this program and asking me to come in and talk, both about this and then about the Chicago water stuff tomorrow, they really stressed this notion of showing ways of thinking and ways of teaching about these issues that are probably similar for the Middle Eastern stuff as well as the Middle Western stuff. And so that's really what I'm going to talk about today. We will get into the nuts and bolts of one particular case study, which is the upstream and downstream issues on the Tigris-Euphrates system. But what I'm really going to talk about is how to look at these river systems and how to read media reports, which is for most of us and most of our students what we see. When I teach a class, I like to make these ridiculous absolute statements like people downstream don't deserve water or else they should move upstream, right? And I like my students to look at me and go, yeah, but, right? I like those yeah, but moments, right? And unfortunately, we don't get enough of them at any level that we teach of. We don't get enough of these yeah, buts, this critical thinking. So what I'm really going to explain here is critical thinking and interpretation of all kinds of dangerous stuff that happens in the media and what happens then if we believe it. So, and then tomorrow, when I come back, not only will you all receive a copy of Before the Wells Run Dry, but we will talk about a lot of the same issues, about how you manage water resources that don't obey political boundaries, how you have these conflicts between nations, states, municipalities, and water users. And a lot of that is very similar to what we're going to talk about today. Just a few general thoughts on water. There are no substitutes. You need water. Borders, I think you've already talked about. We'll look at some maps tomorrow, as well as some maps today, that these imposition of borders, be it national borders, state, or municipal, often don't make a whole lot of sense when you actually look at watersheds. Here in the United States, we lost this battle during the presidency of Thomas Jefferson, when we were looking at westward expansion and how you would lay out states, counties, and municipalities. His lead geographer was trying to encourage that all of the new states to the west of the Appalachian Mountains should be based on watershed boundaries. And if you know Thomas Jefferson, he really liked squares. And so we have all these squares. States, they're all squares, and the counties are even more like squares, and then many of the municipalities are as well. Water, unlike a lot of other resources like aluminum or gold or coal, it moves around, it moves through the sky, it moves through the ground. There's differences whether you're looking at rivers or groundwater sources or lakes. And what I'm really going to talk about here is a river system. Tomorrow we'll talk a little bit more about groundwater as well as Lake Michigan. These upstream, downstream effects are very real. If you're at the top of the system, you are pretty much in charge. The effects of your consumption, of your inputs, and your withdrawals of that water have exponential effects downstream. If you're taking water out and you're putting chemicals, fertilizers, other pollutants, salt, human waste, if you're putting those in the water, it gets more and more concentrated downstream. That's certainly the case in the Tigris-Euphrates system. As you withdraw water, there's less water downstream, and in a place like the Tigris and Euphrates, you get even more evaporation. There's also issues with different contours. Turkey, where these river systems start, is a very mountainous region. Syria and Iraq, where these waters flow through, is a very flat alluvial plain, where the water, reservoirs as they get built are much shallower, more evaporation. So there are different effects in different places. And what tends to happen when I started to look at these issues, as we'll see in some of the media reports, you get a disconnection between places, like the marshes of Iraq, and the system that they are connected to. And all of the reports talk about Iraq's marshes, Iraq's marshes, Iraq's marshes, and not the Tigris and Euphrates river system. And that is one of the dangers that we'll talk about, and how we need to think about and teach about and talk with our students about looking at these things. Water systems are not good for looking at places. You have to look at systems and places within those systems. All right. Transboundary water management here, specifically rivers, is very difficult. It requires trusting your neighbors, which is not something we even do a lot. That's why we build fences and soundproof our walls and things like that, grow hedges. We don't trust our neighbors. So if you're hoping that your neighbor is managing the water correctly, you often just have to hope. And maybe they're going to report with some data on what they're doing, and maybe not. My uncle is a veterinarian. He used to work on salmon fisheries on the Canadian and the U.S. border, and you generally think of Canadians as being very good people. Talk to my uncle someday about salmon fishery management on the border and hear his thoughts on what poor neighbors the Canadians are because of all of the things they don't do that they are required to by agreements between the U.S. and Canada. This is true for water management, fisheries management, and everything else. And again, watersheds, the capture basin for water, they just don't line up with too many countries, let alone states or municipalities. While there are agreements about the management of rivers, often those are agreements in name only. It's tough to monitor those. It's tough to hold other nations, let alone states or municipalities, accountable for their actions. It's hard to punish them if they do something wrong, particularly if you are the downstream country. And in a lot of the watershed management and river management agreements that you get, you have these two conflicting beliefs that they try and promulgate in all of these agreements. One is this sort of equitable use thing, and this is a concern primarily of upstream states. It says that everybody on the system should be able to consume the water, produce things with the water, but it often doesn't account for the downstream effects of that use upstream. On the opposite side is this obligation not to cause appreciable harm. This is language that shows up in almost every water agreement. The problem there is that for downstream parties, they don't want their water showing up impaired, but almost always the upstream communities are doing something to impair the waters. And so you have these two different legal constructs that are often at ends in these water management agreements, and it's a tough thing to overcome. We talked a little bit about some different hotspots. You actually saw this map earlier of the Nile. There are a lot in the Middle East. I spent most of my time here at the university focusing on this one in the middle. And the border that has been imposed here on the national borders is the watershed of the Tigris and Euphrates river systems. Tomorrow, when we see some other maps, it also looks a lot like the border of the Babylonian Empire, some of the later Muslim kingdoms that were there, and actually is pretty consistent with the Ottoman Empire's control of the region. Now that is nice because you have one large political unit in charge of this whole watershed. After World War II and the creation of these nation states, now you suddenly have Turkey controlling the headwaters, Syria with a portion, Iraq with a large portion. There are tributaries in Iran, the parts that stretch into Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Jordan. They're part of the watershed, but that depends on water infiltrating the ground back into aquifers, which doesn't happen because people use the water before it can filter into the ground. And here's that map blown up a little bit. So when I started looking in this system, originally I was looking at the upstream issues. I was looking at I'm supposed to talk about dams. There are lots of dams on this system. Many of them are in Turkey and part of a huge, much like India, sort of national economic development project, which we'll get to in a second. But I was looking at these upstream effects and just sort of one day said, I'm kind of curious as to what's going on sort of at the other end of this system, because it's not, if you read the reports on economic development, hydro development in Turkey, they don't talk about the downstream very much at all. So I started looking at what's happening downstream and noticed something very quickly, that when you look at what's happening in the marshes of southern Iraq, which are this area where the Tigris and Euphrates come together just north of the Persian Gulf, they don't talk about what's happening upstream, and this is inherently problematic. So we're going to talk about the marshes, and we'll come back to Turkey and what it all means. I'm not going to read all this. This is from a United Nations Environmental Program report talking about the huge, immense tragedy that is the destruction of these marshes. What's interesting here, though, is the second sentence. Dams and drainage schemes have transformed one of the finest wetlands, the fabled Eden of the Fertile Crescent that has inspired humanity for millennia, into salt-encrusted desert. Okay? This idea that dams and drainage schemes have transformed the system is very different than the rhetoric that is picked up in the media, which we're going to talk about, where everybody's favorite boogeyman of the 1990s, Saddam Hussein, plays a very, very pronounced role. Here are some shots of the marshes. They're very nice pictures. They're also all from the 1960s, but these are the same photographs that keep getting used today when people talk about restoration. This is, if you listen to most folks, this is what the marshes should look like. Anything less than this is suboptimal. So here we have folks working with water buffaloes and boats. Reed collection was very significant in the interior of the marshes, making paper, baskets, food for the water buffaloes, houses, everything. And it was an interesting pattern of one particular tribe within the marshes, the Medan, who would cultivate these reeds and shape the landscape of the marshes from inside. They were always in competition with another group on the fringes of the marshes who were more interested in the water buffaloes and actually agricultural production. So you have this interior conflict within the marshes of two different groups with two different land use patterns. You wouldn't know it if you just read BBC or the Washington Post. Here's what many of the houses in the interior look like. These are little houses on little islands. The water supply for this region is the water that you see right here. So not only would the water buffalo be in and around this water, but people would go to the bathroom in it, use it for bathing, use it for drinking. It's interesting. One of the reasons why the regime of Saddam Hussein took so much interest in this area is because it was sort of like Sherwood Forest. It's a remote area. It's far from the big cities. And people that didn't like Saddam Hussein tended to congregate in these areas. They're more associated with other ethnic groups in Iran than they are with people in the rest of Iraq. And yeah, he didn't like them very much. But what you can see here is not only how isolated it is, but the quality of life issues that many of the people here had to go through. Many of them were here because they didn't want to be out more visible in the rest of Iraq, not because they liked drinking, wastewater and polluted water from the water right under their houses. More folks in boats, more shots from the 1960s. I'll give this to you, a whole series of books. All of these photos, sorry, not the 1960s. These are from the Gavin Young book, 1977. All right, so here we are in 2010, and this is what it looks like today. It doesn't look like it used to. It's dried up. Much of it is dried up. About 90% of the original extent of the marshes are dried up. It looks kind of like this. That white stuff in the top corner is salt from the ground. Here's what it looks like. It's not too pretty. And here's a map. This is the 1973 on the left and 2000 on the right. The green is permanent marsh. The white, obviously on the right, is the former extent. And so you can see over the course of these 30 years, huge retraction of the extent of these marsh systems. What you can also see, you can't probably see it because you're too far away, but you start to have these straight lines imposed, and those are canals that were built during the 70s and 80s during the Ba'athist regime, partially to take some water out of the marshes, but partially to take the dirty agricultural runoff from further north in Iraq and run it through the marshes without contaminating them. They're just trying to get rid of this water, and it actually goes into a hole in the ground out in the middle of the desert to try and recharge one of the aquifers. Those canals were planned by the Ottoman Empire and never built. They were built in the 1970s instead of the 1870s. Similar map. This is satellite photo, again, showing the original extent, and you can sort of see it there in the blue, and then the extent in the year 2000. We learn about the problems in the marshes not from the folks living in the marshes. We learn from sort of global experts who are speaking in the media or speaking to members of the U.S. Congress or decision makers in Italy, Japan, Canada, a host of other large, wealthy nations that have taken an interest in restoration of the marshes. And these global actors are sort of framing these local issues in ways that are problematic if you're going to talk about restoration or management. Different folks have different interests. If an engineer is looking at this, he says build more canals. If an economist is looking at it, he says assign water rights. And so you have all these different solutions proposed. And it's tough to really tell what's going on. I'm not going to talk too much about that. I'll come back to that. So 4 dangers as I started to read through a lot of the media accounts of what's going on here. And these are very common things if you critically analyze a lot of the text on environmental problems everywhere. And I'll go through a little bit on each one. This simultaneous globalization and localization of the marshes, the exaggerated agency of Saddam Hussein, which was one of the biggest issues happening in these stories. This process of sort of isolating and homogenizing the inhabitants, and then these arbitrary concepts of time and nature, which we will talk about. If you read through these stories, if you go home and Google, so they're always referred to as the Mesopotamian wetlands or the cradle of the Eden and Gilgamesh and all of these things that unite all of us because we are all human. This is the place where human civilization supposedly started. So it's globalizing this. It's making it somehow significant to our lives, at the same time removing the problems and the solutions from any sort of local context. At the same time, they're localizing the problems, taking them out of the Tigris and Euphrates system. So it's an issue of a place in a specific country. So here they're always called Iraq's marshes, Iraq's marshes, Iraq's marshes, as opposed to, say, the marshes at the terminus, junction point of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, which happen to be, these days, in southeastern Iraq. Right? It takes them out of the river system and just makes it a problem that is in Iraq, which means the solutions are in Iraq. Right? Not X, then Y. And these are the kinds of maps that you see about the maps that we just saw, showing the marshes in Iraq, just the place where they are, and not where they are located on the entire system. Syria and Turkey are typically not shown on these maps even though that's where the majority of the water does or does not come from. Saddam Hussein was a bad guy. His regime killed a lot of people living in these marshes, again, because there was, some of them were outlaws fighting against his regime. Others were cousins of those outlaws, supporting them, giving them food, etc. At the same time, his regime also did things like clear agricultural land, build health clinics and libraries and post offices on the periphery of the marshes, cultivate the oil fields in Basra, create a lot of jobs there. This is what the administration did, and it gave people a lot of options. Many people left the marshes because they were scared. Many people left the marshes to get a job in Baghdad or Basra. Many people got killed. And so it's a more complicated story from that angle than just Saddam was a bad guy rampaging through the marshes, killing everybody. The other problem here is that not all of the problems in the marshes are caused even by the Iraqi government, let alone this one man. If you position all of this as issues of Saddam Hussein, and here's a couple of U.S. congressmen speaking about the allocation of foreign aid money to Iraq, again, Saddam Hussein is the problem. That makes the solutions sort of undoing what Saddam did. If Saddam built a dike, you tear down the dike. If Saddam tore down a dike, you rebuild the dike, right? So the opposite of Saddam Hussein here is construed as good. Okay? This becomes particularly problematic when in the official marshland restoration plan for the Iraqi government, they're still talking about the work of Saddam Hussein and not looking at the marshes as this endpoint of a larger hydrological system, which is the case with the restoration plan. And there's just one of the canals that they built. This problem of the inhabitants of the marshes not really showing up in the media is very true. They're construed only as the victims. Their role for thousands of years in managing the landscape of the competitions between different ethnic groups and different tribes, the people who cultivated reeds versus the people who raised water buffaloes, don't show up. But in fact, the few stories that do show up about them show that lots of the people left, lots of the people don't want to go back now that they have libraries and health clinics and they don't have to drink their foul wastewater. And this is a problem. If you're going to manage these wetlands, if you're going to try and return them to the state that they were in before, you need the people to go back, cut down the reeds, grow the water buffalo, and many of them don't want to go back. And then there's this idea that 1973, which is when all those maps come from, is also when Saddam Hussein rose to power. The idea that nothing had happened before 1973, and so that 1973 is somehow the natural state of things, is just wrong. You don't see maps before 1973, partially because we didn't have great satellite photography technology before then. But it is not correct because, here are my dams, in southeastern Turkey this entire time, since Kemal Ataturk and the rise of the Turkish national government, there's been a huge project in southeastern Turkey. Dozens and dozens of dams in this entire area here. You can see different agricultural projects. The green ones are already in operation. The orange ones are in planning. The pink ones are in reconnaissance, which is somehow different than planning. Large millions and millions and millions of acres of land being brought into agricultural production. That requires building dams, and dams do a lot of things, which Professor Morrison just talked about. They lead to temperature changes downstream. If you're doing mass agricultural projects, you get runoff of fertilizer and other chemicals. All of that heads downstream. Part of the problem here is that the entire Tigris-Euphrates River system for agricultural purposes was dependent on the spring flood cycle, which is now totally altered by these dams. And so the ground in Iraq and the water flowing over it is increasingly contaminated with salts and agricultural chemical runoff that now doesn't get washed out to sea because there is no more spring flood. The dams in Turkey are used for creating electricity, which they need to release a certain amount of water all the time to create a consistent electrical flow. So you don't get those flood cycles. The agricultural development in Turkey also happens to be right on top of where the Kurdish population in Turkey lives, a more nomadic population, trying to settle some of these people. This was the ultimate solution to the Kurdish problem in Turkey, was to give them jobs as farmers and make them dependent on canals and dams and things that the Turkish government would control. That's a subject of a different talk. What's happened since 2003 when Saddam Hussein was captured? Well, first, if you look at some of the media stories, Bush replaces Saddam Hussein. It's very interesting. Suddenly, as Saddam Hussein's government fell, people went out with backhoes and shovels and tore down dikes, and a lot of water flowed back into the marshes. And so you see a lot of rhetoric about the Bush administration sort of saving these, just as you saw rhetoric about the Hussein regime destroying them. Dikes were broken. They did get sort of restored to 70% of the original footprint, but all of the water that was now flowing around in these marshes was all of this agricultural runoff that the canals had been partially built to get rid of. So now you have huge levels of phosphates, ammonia, nitrate, some of these other agricultural byproducts sitting here in these marshes. You don't have people going back because they like toilets and electricity and things that don't exist in the marshes. And so you have terrible water quality. People don't want to go back and live there. And since 2006, there's been a huge drought in the entire region, particularly in Turkey, which means the Turks are less and less likely to release water downstream. So the marshes, which had sort of restored to about 70% of their original footprint, are back to about 10% right now. There is, however, a growing realization, even in the media, and I apologize if any of you are former reporters, there is this growing realization that, Saddam Hussein's gone, and yet somehow these marshes are only 10% of their original footprint. Something else must be going on. So, what do we get from all this? Well, ultimately, we all live downstream of somebody, right? And as we look at these issues, you have to not look at the place, but look at the system. The media didn't do it in this case, although they're starting to. And as we explore these topics with our students, it's a perspective that we really need to take on. Loud or powerful is not always the same as right. This is very true. The large international organizations involved in restoration of these marshes speak on the side of good, but they're not telling the whole story, which is problematic when we start investing dollars in restoration projects. And then this idea that somehow we can recreate a natural system without all of the parts that went into it in the first place is dangerous as well. So that is the presentation. I look forward to the Q&A. I look forward to coming back tomorrow and talking about Chicago water issues. So thank you very much.